At first glance, this horse looks like it's been painted with a dozen different colors, but here's the secret. I only used 3. In this video, I'll walk you through my step-by-step process for painting a realistic white horse in watercolor using just the primary colors. Along the way, I'll share tips on sketching, mixing luminous hues, capturing expressive eyes, and painting that flowing white mane. Let's dive in. So the 3 colors I'm using in this video are Daniel Smith Phthalo Blue Green Shade, New Gamboge, and Pyrrole Scarlet. My paper is Fabriano Artistico 140-pound cotton cold-pressed watercolor paper on a 5x7-inch block. The nice thing about blocks is that the sides are glued down except for one little corner where you can stick a credit card or a palette knife to remove it once your painting is finished. It stays flat for you the entire time you're working. My brushes are by Silver. This is a silver BelleAqua size 8 round brush. It's a gorgeous synthetic brush from their new line. And of course, I'll be using my favorite Silver Black Velvet size 8 round brush, which is a synthetic and natural bristle blend. Always have a rag or paper towel handy for blotting and a couple of water jars. Now for the sketch, I start with some timid markings. I just try to get the overall proportions and sizing on my paper. I want the ear tips to come almost to the top, so you can see just a rough block in here. Once I'm happy with the overall proportions, I can go in with stronger lines and more confident markings. I start with those curved ear tips, making sure that the distance between the ear is correct compared to what I'm seeing in the reference photo. Then the slope of the forehead, the nice dished face. Arabian horses, of course, are known for that beautiful curve in their face. Now, I drew a lot of horses as a kid, so this is something that comes fairly easily to me, but it's really just a question of comparing distances. For example, I compare the distance between the light shape in the forehead to the shadow shape on the jaw. It's a little bit wider in the light shape than the shadow. And from there, once I have overall placement, I can start to refine the features like the nostril, the anatomy of the side of the face, and add the flowing mane and the neck. If you're going to be painting something with a lot of white in it, it's good to plan ahead for where those white shapes are going to be, like the flowing mane in the front. But don't press too hard with your pencil. Otherwise, you'll leave a lot of graphite residue on your paper, and when you apply the paint, that can kind of blur into your painting. So working on a white subject like this, keep that in mind. Now for the placement of the eye, I actually had to do it twice. I started with the eye slightly too high, so I had to go in, erase it, and try it again, just a little bit lower. Again, I'm making comparisons between the mandible and the ear and the side of the face, and just judging those distances. This does get easier with practice, so don't give up if you're struggling with the sketching. Now, I did end up redoing the ears one more time. They were just a little bit too low on the head, so I brought them up a little higher and actually made them slightly smaller and then widened the neck. So the kneaded eraser comes in handy. I use it at the very end to knock down some of those lines a little bit lighter. So with the sketch finished, we're ready to start painting. I'm going to use a surprising color first. This is Phthalo Blue Green Shade in a milky consistency. And I just use this to carefully paint in the entire shadow on the right side of the face, starting by slowly blocking in the shadow around the muzzle and then along the jawline. Negative painting around any light shapes that are creeping in, like that curve along the jaw. And then applying a little bit of wet into wet New Gamboge to create a glow along the bottom of the face. Now, it's important when you're using wet and wet techniques like this to think about the consistency of the paint on your brush. It should match the consistency of the paint on the paper and not have any excess water in it. Continuing on, I'm just applying that phthalo blue green shade to the shadow on the ear and negative painting around some of those swooping hairs that are catching the light on the mane. If this is too tricky, of course, you can save that for the end. I don't know if you noticed, but I have a little jar of bleed-proof white sitting there ready for me. I'm going to use that for some of the white hairs at the very end. But here I'm completing that shadow shape with the phthalo blue while also applying some golden strands of New Gamboge to the hair that's sweeping across, blowing in the wind. I paint in the eye with a single wash as well. Now, when I'm working on a white subject like this, I like to add a background because it helps the head pop forward more in space and just feel more three-dimensional. It also gives me an anchor point with a dark value so that I can start to compare my midtones and darks to that. So I'm mixing up New Gamboge and phthalo blue to create a nice murky green for the background. I like to drop in pure color wet into wet as I work so that the colors look interesting and are blending beautifully into that background. I don't prefer to mix just a solid color and paint it all in. I think that looks kind of boring. So wet into wet is my favorite technique to use for blurry looking backgrounds to give it kind of that blurred photo look. And then if you really want to make the background dark, you can add in some Pyrrole Scarlet, and that actually kind of cancels out the green and makes a really beautiful, deep, rich black. So the use of all three primaries together can create a gorgeous dark for your background. And then I add in a little bit more yellow in this area towards the bottom of the painting, perhaps to suggest some foreground foliage that's a little bit closer to us in space. Remember, when you're painting a background and you're choosing colors, that cool colors like blues tend to recede and warmer colors come forward. Here I'm mixing up a nice peach tone using my smaller silver BelleAqua brush. It's just a combination of Pyrrole Scarlet and New Gamboge. And I know it looks a little bit dark on this first wash, but remember, watercolors dry lighter. So I apply this to the front of the face where we see that peach colored muzzle. And you can actually paint this right over the top of that blue shadow since this area is going to be much darker. Remember to plan your layers accordingly. Any layers you have underneath will be affected by the colors you apply on top and vice versa. So because we're using transparent paints, think about how those colors will look painted over the top of each other. Now, to mix a perfect black, I use Pyrrole Scarlet and Phthalo Blue in a very creamy consistency. And I'm using my smaller brush to begin painting those really fine facial details, the curved backward C shape of the nostril, the line of the mouth, that black shadow just to the left of the muzzle, and all of these darker gray shadows along the jawline. Notice how I water down or dilute the paint a little bit more as I'm working my way across because this area is not quite as dark as the muzzle. So you're going to be constantly needing to make value shifts in your paint by either making your paint more creamy for dark values like here on the eye, or you can dilute it slightly for lighter values. Now to make that brown, I actually combined my peach tone with my gray from the Phthalo Blue and Pyrrole Scarlet. Makes a perfect brown, and I'm using that in a very diluted consistency to paint some of these subtle anatomical features of the face. I'm also applying this across the muzzle to darken it again. Now really quick, if you feel like this video is just moving too fast and you'd like to see it in real time without skipping any steps, this tutorial is available in my Watercolor Mastery membership, along with hundreds of other tutorials and many more horse tutorials if that's your jam. I'll leave a link in the description so you can check that out if you'd like to follow along in real time. Now for the forehead, I want to leave this mainly the white of the paper, but there needs to be some very light washes helping define the features. So this is a very, very watered down, barely tinted wash of that light brown that I used for the muzzle. And I'm just adding that to the face here. And then a darker value around the muzzle one more time. And then with a little bit of murky New Gamboge, I paint in the center of those ears. When you're working on a subject that's in strong light and shadow like this, you want to concentrate most of your detail and attention to the areas that are in the light. After all, light is what reveals form, so that's where you're going to see most of the details anyway. Whereas in the shadows, you can let some of those details disappear. Especially here along those transitional areas where the light meets the shadow, you're going to see a lot of different shapes appearing. You can use a dry brush technique like this where you're gently scraping your brush across the surface of the paper to produce kind of a fuzzy texture, indicating some of the short horsehair on the face. I have a barely damp brush that has some paint on it, scraping it across the surface to create that effect. And then once the facial features are done, you can use much looser, more broad brush strokes for the neck and the mane. I'm just using some of my dark combinations of the Phthalo Blue and Pyrrole Scarlet to finish the mane and the neck, and using some blending techniques, wet next to wet, to produce soft edges everywhere here. Once those areas are dry, you can go back in and add more detail. And here on the background, I'm just kind of washing that color into the shadowy mane to help blend together those edges so they're not so stark and outlined. Now the fun part is adding the final details like these white strands of hair overlapping the background and over the eye. For this, I'm just using my Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White and a delicate feathery brush stroke to apply some stray hairs, and then if there are any areas that are bothering you, like washes that maybe are looking a little blotchy, once they're completely dry, you can add some water and scrub those out. And there is the final result. I was really happy with how this one turned out, and I had a lot of fun with it. Thanks for watching today. I hope you'll join me over at Watercolor Mastery for more tutorials like this one. I'll see you there.